So first of all, I am also, like you in your project, very interested in a general approach to teleology rather than just looking at specific applications. The paper I sent you was focusing on biological teleology, but I have written other things about other forms of teleology. In particular, there are two others. One is the one that's associated with intentional human actions. And the other one is the teleology that's embedded in artifacts that we make and use for certain purposes, the kind of teleology or function. So there are other papers that I've written trying to explain the case for a general theory and describe what it is. And let me just tell you the key idea. I don't know to what extent you've had a chance to look into this or been interested in this, but my leading idea was that the general, what unifies different kinds of teleology is that they're all explaining things by reference to some kind of value, some good that's brought about. So most of the metaphysics of teleology in the 20th century philosophy has been trying to remove anything like value or anything kind of squishy from teleology. And I thought my first instinct was that that was throwing away the crucial thing about teleology, at least as we've understood it in the past. And the idea is not that this perspective is limited to the way people have thought about the role of value and in teleology in the past, but rather that that was an interesting idea and it should be pursued in new ways. So it's not really a backward-looking view. It's not sort of, but it's to say there's something important that the earlier, that people have been interested in about teleology, and part of it is explaining, as I say, by reference to value. Now, in the context of biological teleology, the key value involved is the value for the organisms that have features that are adaptations that are created through a process of natural selection. But one of the thoughts I had, I'm not certain it's correct, but one of the thoughts I had was that if you have it's not merely that any natural selection process will produce teleology, because if you have a context, so I had a thought experiment. This is all, how long ago was this? This was, I don't know, 30 years ago. But I was trying to think of a context in which a process like natural selection is happening, but there doesn't seem to be any value involved. Just to see what would our intuitions be about this. And so the case I thought of was inspired by one of the views about the origin of life on Earth. It's a minority view, but it's still one of the views, which is that it started in part through the operation of tiny clay crystals. So the idea is that tiny clay crystals would they have a variety of features. So there's variety that's required for natural selection. Those features are inherited because as a crystal grows, the new growth incorporates the structural features of the previous layers. And if there's a mutation, quote unquote mutation, so a shift in the pattern, the molecules start lining up in a different way, then that change will be inherited by the further layers that are deposited. So there's an analogy of inheritance as well as variety, and a population of these things that have random mutations, and then they're basically competing for space in this porous rock. And if they grow in certain kinds of shapes, then they'll tend to stick in the little tiny crevices in the rock. And if they have a different kind of shape, then they'll get washed through. And so the ones that remain have features, physical structure features that explain why they remain there, because through a process that seems to be just like natural selection. But I was assuming, for the sake of argument, that something like a rock or a crystal isn't alive, doesn't have any intrinsic worth, doesn't make sense to think about anything being good or bad for it, except in some metaphorical sense or attenuated sense. And so it seems like in that case, we might not want to say that those features are for any purpose or have any real teleology. Anyway, that's just why I was looking for a case like that, to try to test whether value really was crucial in the biological teleology, or whether it was really just natural selection in any form that was crucial. So anyway, I wanted to highlight that that was one question that I thought about and had have written some other things about. In the particular paper that I sent to you, it's another chapter of the story, which is that I thought that this perspective that I had on biological teleology could, well, it implied various ways you could, as I said in the paper, operationalize this idea. So what I mean by that is just simply, get empirical evidence for it, have some kind of even study it in a scientific way. And normally you wouldn't think of, scientific studies as involving anything like value, but I don't see any barrier if you just say that, organisms continue in existence is good for them. And, there are various things that are good for a lineage. If you assume, it's in its own self-interest to keep the lineage alive, the lineage's self-interest, so to speak, to keep the lineage alive. And so my theory, my view of biological teleology with this value is a kind of familiar sort of ideological based one, but I would try to give this explicit role for, and point out that these explanatory properties are not merely those that give rise to natural selection, but also are, there are cases where things are happening because it's good for something to be that way. So that was the overview. And then in the paper, I just said, if you take that view, you can actually study it scientifically. I was looking at a computer model because it's very easy to get data about every single entity in the population. And it's a model, a kind of very, very simplified model of something like bacterial population. And the interesting thing is that inspired by this idea of biological teleology, you can figure out how would you empirically test for that. And I describe it in the paper. And then some interesting things fall out. Like I think there's a new way to address a long-standing problem in the philosophy of biology, which is the problem of adaptationism that goes back to this very famous paper by Gould and Lewontin, in which they criticize the Panglossian paradigm. You might remember that paper for people in philosophy of biology. And there's been a standard way of replying to it, which is basically to concede the fundamental criticism, I think, and then try to say it's not as bad as you think. And from my perspective, you can just confront the fundamental criticism head on and just say it's wrong. So you don't have to make any concession. There's no second best. So anyway, that's one example of a payoff that I thought there was from this particular way of, the way, if you can objectify value and make it into an empirical question and get empirical evidence for it, then you could potentially, have some new perspectives on longstanding issues in the philosophy of biology, such as adaptationism. And then I gave a second example, which is not a longstanding problem, but one I think should be focused on much more in biology and philosophy of biology, and that's it's basically the question of trying to understand why evolution is as creative as it is. In other words, by creative, I just mean, in a very simple sense, think about the early stages of life when there are things like populations of clay crystals, or maybe things very, very simple like viruses or bacteria, and look at now around in the biosphere, and there are all kinds of, there's still scads of very simple things, but there are also lots of very complicated things. And they're not just complicated, but they're functionally complex in a way that is good for the organisms. It's doing work for these organisms. It's adaptive, it's their adaptations. And so it's good in that sense for these organisms. But this other question that's not so much on the radar, but I think should be, is how is an evolutionary process involving natural selection able to create a complex system of highly functionally articulated and constructed organisms like ourselves and other forms of life? It's not especially about humans. If you just got rid of humans, you could still raise the question from those simple beginnings. And now most people's reaction when I raise this question, like a biologist's typical reaction, or even a layperson's typical reaction, or a philosopher's typical reaction is, wait, I thought I learned that in high school biology. But you didn't learn that. No one actually knows how evolution is so creative. And you may be surprised by that, but let me just give you a simple proof, or what I take to be a proof, which is that if we knew, we could make a model which would exhibit those properties and exhibit the kind of open-ended evolutionary creativity that the biosphere actually seems to exhibit. And there are people in a scientific research community that I've been hanging around with a lot called, they study artificial life, but basically just means strange, unusual forms of life and also models of them. So that's, for example, where this computer model that I was studying, its home and the publications about that stuff are published in artificial life venues. But the idea is that take any hypothesis, people write lots of books. Some people do talk about this. By the way, Gould talks about this. He wrote a fantastic book called Wonderful Life, essentially about this question, and he thought he knew the answer. He thought the answer was, it's a total accident that things got more complex the way they did. If you remember that book, it's a great book. I think his best book, actually, Gould's best book, Wonderful Life. But I think his conclusion is fundamentally wrong. That's what I'm trying to say here. Because well, first of all, when you look at any one of these computer models, none of them, no one knows how to make one that shows this kind of unfolding, continually, things getting more and more adaptively complex. Doesn't sound like it should be that hard, does it? When we first, in the year 2000, the field of artificial life published a list of the leading open questions, and this was one of them. And there have been lots of people trying to do this. There are lots of hypotheses about how to do this, but when you test them, they fail the test so far. And when we did this in 2000, in the year 2000, I was predicting, oh, it feels like we almost know this. We know all the essential stories. We have some good hypotheses anyway, and it's just a matter of, say, 2 years. Let's work on it really hard. We'll get this one cracked and we can move on. So 20 years later, no, hasn't been cracked. A lot of people have been working on it. So that's an example of a new problem that's not so much on the radar screen, or at least people think it has an old solution. So they're not paying much attention to it now. But I was saying this thing that I've been doing of objectifying values in teleology, this biological teleology, gives you a way to tell whether that test is being passed. Because if you have a creative system, it'll exhibit a certain kind of statistical behavior that you can measure. And I showed you I kind of gestured at how you'd make those measures. And I can't remember from the paper if I cited the scientific sources behind it, but I certainly can if anyone is interested. So that's I don't know, that might have been 5 or 10 minutes, but that's a way of summarizing what I was trying to do in the paper.
I'd like to kick off with 2 questions. One is a question arising from very, very deep ignorance. So some of the technical discussion in your paper was completely beyond me. So excuse me if this question is really benighted, but I didn't understand how the figures in your paper support your own value-based theory of teleology or function, as opposed to some rival views like the fitness contribution theory or something like that. Could you say a bit more about that? How the population dynamics that you show support specifically your view that teleology has to do with the good of the organism or entity?
Yeah. So yes, good question. Let me tell you what I can do and what I can't do in answer. So I can't. Well, this is why I brought up the clay crystallites earlier, because they fit natural selection, and you could make diagrams for their traits which would look just like the ones in the paper. So I think you're right, Daniel, that the figures don't prove the value-oriented perspective that I believe is insightful and I'm interested in. They don't. The thing that would prove that, if anything would prove it, it's more like the clay crystallite thought experiment and things like that. That's a separate paper, and I'm happy to show you that paper. And the gist is what I explained, though. And instead, in this paper, what I was doing was saying, let's not assume we use this evidence as proving that the value orientation is right, but if it's right, what could you say? Well, then we could say, if we're explaining traits by the utility of their effect, then the traits that have utility, that are good for the organisms, those are going to be spreading. So we're measuring how traits are spreading. But it's based on this hypothesis. So we're saying we're working out the implications of this hypothesis. And then you'd expect to see pictures just like those ones I showed you. And you can go and look at like what's causing this particular track, like which genome is that? And is it actually, this genome is taking off, it's spreading through the population and it leaves a line like that. And it's particularly spreading fast. Those are the lines that are the high lines. And you can go back, and we've done microanalysis and gone back in and say, well, what is the real reason why that thing is spreading? And it always is because there's some benefit in the sense of increasing the probability the thing will survive or reproduce. So what we're really operationalizing is just the kind of the ideological perspective on biological functions, and it doesn't by itself. Someone who doesn't like the value theory, but just doesn't like the value overlay, but does like the ideological perspective, can still use those diagrams to make, they can say, from my perspective, here's what I would draw from those diagrams. So anyway, that's why I say I can answer your question to some extent, but also to some extent, this is not the paper that tries to answer that question.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very helpful, and yeah, that makes a lot of sense. My second question relates to metaphysics proper. I find your value-based approach really cool, and I think it's one of the most intuitive analyses of teleology around. But I'm wondering about the metaphysical implications of it. So do you find appeals to value spooky at all? What sorts of things are these values supposed to be, or do you prefer to be neutral on this issue?
Well, I have thought about it, and I think values are somewhat spooky, to me. That's to say they're unanswered philosophical questions about them, metaphysical questions about them. And so I sympathize with that. Let's see, what else would I want to say here? So I consider basically this as the answer to your question, I think, is an open area to be explored. And I've done some exploring, but I don't feel like I've canvassed the whole, got to the bottom of it. And the reason is simply that I got more interested in this other stuff that I was talking about in the paper. I've been spending the rest of my career like mostly doing that kind of stuff and leaving the value and teleology behind. So I haven't actually thought about that specific, as I mentioned to you earlier in the email, Daniel, for a while. But it was hard. I was having to think about, do we need a notion of intrinsic value? So I was reading about that. And like, for example, the crystallites don't seem to have any intrinsic value, as far, at least normally the way we think about it intuitively, it doesn't seem to fit there. Of course, it's very hard to know because our intuitions, I think, are not, a faultless guide to these kind of things. But organisms, on the other hand, do seem to, any form of life has some kind of intrinsic value, it seems, at least, to itself. And so in fact, the general, my instinct would be to think about how kind of go back to a figure like Aristotle, think about how Aristotle thought value played a role in the world. And I think Aristotle would think it was objective and real. It had, sort of explanatory power. And then Aristotle, of course, had a lot of other metaphysical views. So what I'm imagining, what I was trying to do was think, can we take that aspect of Aristotle's views about value and their role in the metaphysical standing and subtract the rest of Aristotle's metaphysics, which is, long gone, and we're not particularly, most of us aren't wedded to or attracted to anymore. And I think it's an open question whether that really works. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I'm to describe the idea that I had, the leading idea about value being at the core of teleology, but I'm not sure that it's right. I tried to develop it as much as I could and make the strongest case for it. And I did it in these different contexts, and wrote separate papers about the mental teleology components and the artifacts and things. But at the end of the day, I don't think I convinced myself 100% that it's right. But I also don't think it's been refuted either. And I think it's going to require someone to think through some hard questions, maybe your team, which is, can you really make values into something that are I'm basically a naturalist in the sense that I don't think there's spooky things going on, in the world. I don't have any reason, not that there's some in principle reason there can't be things that are spooky, or I think we have to understand everything about the world, but I'm going to go there only when pushed and shoved, and I don't feel that I'm pushed and shoved into that corner yet, but I think it's still an open question, is I guess what I'm saying. So I think another very good question, and I was kind of hoping that this idea might have enough legs that some other people would want to explore it too.
Hi, I'm Dilara again. I'm a second-year PhD student, and I work on artificial intelligence and evolution in the relation to especially this social emotions and how and why we don't or we can accept them as moral agents or not. So I am doing in philosophy, so I'm coming from a philosophical perspective. But I was also curious about this relation between teleology and evolution. So I'm also I read a couple of your papers in terms of life literature as well. So I'm interested in many things, but my question would be about your draft your paper that you sent to us, and especially about cultural evolution. And as far as I remember, you define cultural evolution as somewhat hyper-creative. And I was curious how could you explain further this hyper-creativity, if creativity is something about novelty, usefulness, and non-obviousness. So what is the difference in the sense of this hyper-creativity is something different? Because if I think about some kind of values, I'm interested in especially moral values or cultural values, or I am also a bit confused in terms of how you define values for the, in terms of the point about the cultural evolution. So thank you.
Yeah. Let's see, let me first say a little bit about cultural evolution and then about hypercreativity.
Mm-hmm.
When I talk about cultural evolution, I have in mind a particular kind of thing. That there are various things that deserve to be called cultural evolution. I have a specific thing in mind, which is you have a population of entities that are clearly cultural entities, like, for example, I don't have in mind so much, the beliefs or the value systems that are part of a culture. Those do exist and those do evolve, but I have in mind more something like, well, the example I used was just technology. Mm-hmm. And I think technological inventions are something, created by humans, discovered by humans. It's part of human culture to make these. It seems very natural for us to do these, think of the cities and et cetera that we've left behind us. And so just thinking, if you have a population of entities, so for example, technologies, kinds of technology, those are cultural, I would say. And so if they evolve by a process that's like natural selection, then I would say that's the kind of cultural evolution. Well, first of all, I would call it cultural evolution, but it need not be evolution of beliefs or values or attitudes of people in the culture. That's one kind of thing that can change. Here I'm talking about something much simpler. It's a little bit like if you're a biologist and you go out and observe a bunch of organisms and notice there's a variety, but they fall into groups and those groups evolve over time. And so I'm saying same thing with cultural entities. Think about technologies. They're variety, they fall into different clusters, and also they evolve over time. And so I was very interested in studying cultural evolution because of my passion for this idea of hypercreativity. So let me talk a little bit about hypercreativity. So by that I mean this, well, it's what was illustrated by what's happened in the history of life. Life has exhibited the sort of hypercreativity that that's one example that I'm in. But it turns out that it's very hard to study hypercreativity, to do the kind of analysis that I did of that computer model, because the data is just difficult to get. In principle, if we could sequence every organism in a certain population, and furthermore and do this on a regular time period, like depends on the organism. If it's E. coli, maybe you have to do it every hour. If you have a bucket of E. coli, if it's humans, you might have to do it every year or something like that. But anyway, you'd have a time to study the evolution. You need to have data that's time resolved. So you have to have snapshots, and you need to do the stats I was talking about. I would, in principle, want to know like the complete genome. And maybe if there are any other things, I'm just focusing on the genome, there might be other things that are relevant besides, I'm not a gene reductionist, but, and we're getting more and more data, but the only place we have anything even approaching that is with this long-term evolution experiment that Rich Lenski's lab has done with bacteria, E. coli. But there, they have all the populations and they're frozen for something like 20 years of E. coli evolution. And E. coli go through a generation in like 4 hours. So that's many, 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 hundreds of thousands of generations of E. coli that they're studied. And they've got all the populations, every month or week or whatever, frozen. And you can go and, investigate them. You can thaw them and figure out exactly what's in the population at any time. And I talked with Rich Lenski about this, and I was doing this work that's described in this paper, and he knew why I wanted to do it and said it all made sense, but it would require sequencing the population of a petri dish. And, that's just too expensive to do now, even. You could sample it. You could take one thing out of there and sequence that. That's not too expensive, but there are, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of things in there, and they're not all the same, these bacteria, in a single petri dish, which was like your record from 1 week of this 20-year experiment. And so it just would be incredibly expensive. It's possible, but no one has the money. And NSF isn't going to give you the money for something like that, probably. And we didn't even ask. So I was thinking, well, where else is the same kind of hypercreativity seem to be present? And I thought, well, cultural is evolving in a similar kind of way. It just seems to be exploding, the novelty, just like with life forms. And with certain aspects of culture, we now are just keeping records of stuff. And so someone mentioned to me, they have patent records that go back to the beginning of this country, of the United States, hundreds of years. And each patent is a description by experts that's checked by other experts about what this, what features of this new invention that you're getting a patent on, what those key features are. How is it different from its ancestors? And also on a patent, the key thing was you have to list what's called the prior art, which is your ancestors, so to speak. similar things that existed beforehand that you are now modifying or adding to. And as you know, in cultural evolution, one of the things that's first of all, it's very different from biological evolution in a lot of ways. One way is what I'm pointing to right now, which is that a cultural entity that's produced in one of these populations typically has many parents, not just one, not just two, like in biology. It's much more complicated. Like, what's the average number of earlier patents that are cited by a patent today? It's like 20, the average. And so imagine a biologist studying a form of life where you have 20 parents for each organism, and they're all contributing something. It would just be like, no one has figured out how to do that. Going from one parent to two parents, from asexual to sexual population, they had to redo, add up, make a whole new mathematical population genetics just to handle two parents. And here we're having dozens of parents, and the number varies from different people to different entities, and so it's a mess. So basically, no one has figured out the theory.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the data's there. So, and it's complete. Every single patent and invention is recorded, and it's accurate. Like, it's a fossil record of all the inventions that a biologist would die for. Mm-hmm. Imagine every single entity in the population you want to study leaves an accurate record. So you have complete and accurate information. So so I decided, great, I'm going to study this. And I've been studying the patent record and other similar digital repositories of evolving systems, because that's where the data is, and you can do these kind of analyses much more readily. So I thought culture is a good place to go find this sort of stuff. Let's go, and the patents are a good place to start. And so that's how I got into it, because I thought that it did exhibit a similar kind of hypercreativity. The way the population is evolving is significantly different, so we'll get new insights, and we can get traction there. And we couldn't get traction in biology, but I think in a matter of time, the costs will come down, and eventually you could do similar kind of experiments with life forms, in which case I want to do them too. So I hope that helps, Dilara, to answer your questions about what I mean by cultural evolution, why I was interested in it and got into it, and what hypercreativity means.
Yeah, thank you for that super clear and long answer. I now understood what you actually meant, and now I think even more about, if we put in terms of this evolving systems or artificial systems or some kind of AI, I think this reminds me of one of the problems about the way that AI algorithms or this NLP, like natural language processing algorithms, work. That the problem is there's lots of data, but almost like there is no origin or there's no parent for this artificial intelligence, in the way that we don't know what kind of judgments or processing it is doing. We do it, but it is so much different in the way that it works and it processes. But I am still in the moment that I'm not sure where would you put possible future artificial intelligence in this case. Maybe the problem of origin will be so much bigger for them, but if they're just artifacts, they're just like kind of technological artifacts that we are creating, it is much different, obviously. But thanks very much. It definitely helps much. Thank you again.
Yeah, let me just follow up a little bit more too, to say that I completely agree with what you're just saying now, that there are lots of foundational questions that that haven't been answered yet. And so we're having to answer them. For me, in a way, that's a plus, because there's one way to think about it is there's a lot of lower hanging fruit, because no one has been here yet. And we're some of the first people, so we can get some of this low hanging fruit. But it turns out the low hanging fruit is not that low. It still requires a bunch of reaching, and it's kind of hard to get to it, because we're having to figure out some really basic things. Like, as I was saying, I'm trying to do a theory. I have been for a few years, and I'm still in the middle of it, a theory of what goes on in a population where you have these hyper parental systems, many, many parents. And so traits are mixing much more rapidly. And I'd like to there are various philosophers and biologists, and I think people who study cultural evolution who think they know about these kinds of systems, about what would happen when you have hyperparentality. But I don't think that I'm not very confident that those preconceptions are true. Yeah. And but we do have a way now to get traction. And I think actually, you know what I predict is that the social sciences are going to be completely revolutionized. It's like what happened 60 years ago, 70 years ago in biology, when molecular biology was introduced. And it's completely, as you know, probably revolutionized biology. Sometimes, in many cases, departments just split. The old biology department no longer exists, or it's like it has a certain name. And then the molecular biology department is a separate department, and that's where all the money is. And they're producing, and it's partly that they're just gobs of data that they can get their hands on, and then you can explain all kinds of things, or at least you can frame all kinds of very precise questions that you can answer. And so I think what we're doing is a similar kind of thing. Social sciences historically very, very ideological, a lot of it, ideology driven rather than data driven. And so this is a data driven enterprise, but it does shed light on social sciences. And I think it's a new methodology that's, the computational methods are central. And I think well, in fact, there are already conferences and journals, I think, on computational social science. And that's what I'm talking about. I think that's just going to mushroom. And I think what I'm doing, it feels like I'm just one of the early players in this field. And it's very exciting for me, partly because, as I said, it's possible to get traction. And, I feel like I'm making progress. And in philosophy, that's really, well, as you guys know, it's so hard to make clear progress in philosophy. And I try to do that.
Yeah, it is challenging. But yeah, hopefully we will be one of the first PhDs who are looking at this new concepts of how to explain the whole this philosophy of artificial intelligence is so new, and the literature is very new, and hopefully it will change so many things. Even the idea of putting philosophy of artificial intelligence with evolutionary perspective is very, very new. So many people are not doing that yet, but I'm hoping that I will be also one of the first ones to do that. But thank you. Thanks very much for your answer. Yeah. Thanks.
I see there's a question in the chat from Igor. Is that the right name? Let me read through this and try to take a shot at answering this one. So isn't the value orientation you're arguing for retrospectively constructed? If one takes an existing system, one can construct back how it came to be and assign to it a teleology. But this construction will depend on the point from which one looks, what one sees as the value result, and at which point of time. These different things can have clashing values and will construct different teleologies. So can you talk about a teleology without imposing on all systems a universal transcendental reference point to reduce this infinite diversity of teleologies? So interesting question, Igor. So I think you can, and let me see if I can explain. A key thing about my idea is that it's not, I don't think it really is perspectival in the way that it might seem. Because what I do is just observe a population and keep track of genomes, just count the number of copies of a given genome, for example. And then I watch, and you can do this at different levels of analysis, like the whole genome or individual genes or gene clusters, things like that. But just take the genome, and we just observe what happens and collect these statistics, and we notice some of them spread. Well, some of them are introduced and they spread through the population, and then they die out, and the new ones introduced and spread through the population and die out. And we're just counting all these things, counting how common these things are, these different genomes. So there's no presumption yet about anything, although we're interpreting this with this presupposition that, you know, the things that are the forms that are spreading because they have features that are valuable for their increase the probability of them surviving and reproducing. And as I say, I'm making this extra assumption that's not driven by the data yet, but it is assumption, which is that these systems do have intrinsic values. You know, they care about their own, they have interests of their own and things like that. So what I'm assuming that, you know, any one of these things has certain kinds of interests, but the thing is, some of them survive and other ones don't. And I just notice which ones survive, and then I can track what is it about, you know, what specifically was that genome, and I can go and look in it and retrospectively verify that there's something valuable that I can identify, and I can say specifically what it is that was valuable in these individual cases. I mean, usually I can figure it out by looking at the details, but I have just come to be very confident from doing this many times, and especially from doing things like, you know, we have null hypotheses where you have systems that are, you can sort of rule out, you can sort of test various background hypotheses with null hypotheses. So we do that, and I talk a little bit about that in the paper. But in other words, I'm kind of, I'm assuming there is an infinite diversity of different kinds of values, because there are an infinite number of different things, or an indefinite number of different things that seem like life forms and have their own life forms in the way in which any life form has some kind of intrinsic value, it seems to me intuitively. And so I am making that assumption. And so there is that diversity of values, but then I just focus on the ones that survive and see, are they surviving because of some specific advantage that they have? And so those are the ones that pop out. So in other words, I focus on certain things because they're successful, and I can go and check, are they successful just by accident, or is it something that is genuinely valuable about that? You know, I can say specifically what it is that's good about that genome compared to the other ones in the population. And as I just found that I can typically answer that question, you know. So I've come to the conclusion that by induction, the ones that survive are surviving because, you know, not due to chance, but due to their value for that kind of, you know, their contribution to having them succeed in the natural selection fight. So I don't think what's retrospectively is identifying which ones are the winners, but which values to pay attention to. There, I would say I pay attention to all the values in principle, or I recognize, acknowledge all the values that different points of, you know, the different points of all of these intrinsic values that forms of life have, for example, and then I just pay attention to some of them, the ones that survive. So I hope that answers some of what you were was driving your question, Igor.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question that's related to Igor's one, and I was actually thinking whether if you look most, or if you focus most on survival and reproduction, then isn't it the case that you basically reduce most of value to those two features of an organism or an object, and then anything that clashes with these two factors would be eliminated as a value that could drive teleology? And if that is the case, then doesn't that rule out that any kind of moral value could drive this kind of teleology? I mean, I assume that sometimes moral values could clash with reproduction and survival. For example, maybe we would be most just and I don't know, virtuous if we would sacrifice humanity, or if we would sacrifice ourselves and then put an end to reproduction and survival, you know, and then it could clash.
Yeah. So that's an interesting question, Tomas. So when I'm talking about value and teleology as being driven by value, I don't have in mind moral values specifically, or things like justice or virtues. I have in mind the idea that things can basically, it's entities that have interests and serve their interests, and so I'm concerned with kind of low-grade values, not moral values, but just things that benefit things. And the main thing I'm asking is, what kinds of entities could receive a benefit? Does it even make sense conceptually to talk about various things benefiting or harming them? And it seems to me it's things that have, like forms of life, we talk about that way, even simple ones like bacteria or mosquitoes, that we don't have any problem killing. But we know that, it's bad for the mosquito if we kill it. It doesn't mean it's morally bad or anything like that, or unjust. But it's just bad for the mosquito because this mosquito has its own interests, which don't involve, being sacrificed to. And so what I'm saying is not that any value gives rise to teleology, but in the context of biology and natural selection, there it is the values that are associated, the values that are met by the survival and reproduction of a kind of entity. So that's just a very thin kind of value, but it is a real kind of value, I think. And so I'm saying for the biological teleology, it's that kind of value. Now for the mental teleology, it'll be a slightly different kind of value, where intentional action, and there it's more, what the agent, wants, desires, and it's sort of a desire satisfaction and picture of values. But it's not so. But anyway, to make a long story short, the values in my story are very low-grade values. Low. It just depends. There's something that even a bacterium has. A bacterium doesn't have any nervous system. It's not conscious or aware. It doesn't sense its environment, except it picks up sort of chemical gradient signals, but it still has interests, I think we would all say. And so I still think it still has a kind of intrinsic interest. Its interest is for itself, by itself, from itself. It's not imposed by us. I don't think it's just that we think it has an interest. It actually does have an interest, it seems to me. And that's all I'm really appealing to. So yeah, the moral values and justice and virtue are much more complicated. They're specifically, I think, having to do with human beings and human populations and how people live in societies together. So nothing like that is arising in these simple cases that I've been talking about, like, bacterial populations. Does that help, Thomas?
Yeah, sure. And your account is totally fine with me, actually. I'm just, what I have in mind is that if we want to make a unified account of teleology, then I think an important strain of that should be moral teleology, or teleology and ethics. At least that's traditionally a very important slice in teleological thinking. And I just wonder how we could get from not just yours, but other kind of non-moral or morally neutral accounts of teleology to some kind of moral teleology.
I think that's a very interesting idea, and I just have never asked that question, whether there's some form of teleology that specifically is grounded in moral values. And I think you may be right, actually. So I think it's a good thing to look for. I haven't actually looked for it because I was trying to get this sort of basic picture with these broad categories of teleology, the three that I mentioned. But there's clearly more fine-grained details there, and I just didn't get there. But I think it's a good idea to look, and I would expect you. My hunch, so first of all, my hunch is like worth 5 cents, but my hunch is that you could probably, I think there is something there to be found. It's probably going to be more complicated and more difficult to sort out than I was doing the easier stuff, I think, because it makes sense to start on the easy part. But thanks for bringing this up, because I hadn't actually thought about that before. But my intuition is that I bet you're right. There is something there, but my intuition is also that it's not going to be the easiest thing to work out.
Right. May I have a clarificatory question that mostly speaks of my ignorance? Actually, you suggested that most of the models that we would have for evolution or natural selection don't generate that kind of variety, or not hyper creative in the way that actual evolution in the actual world works. And my question is simply how we should imagine a kind of evolution or natural selection that is not like that. Would it produce like a Smith's Army knife of a creature that can solve any problems, and it's a single kind of entity, and there is no more variety, or how it would look?
Well, first of all, I do think that the biosphere, the actual history of life on Earth, is an example of this hypercreativity. So nothing more is required. And I don't think you need to have even humans in the story. Imagine we're looking at, take the story up to whenever it was before humans, like 100,000 years ago. Maybe there were no humans around. I don't know exactly when humans originated, but go back. So I don't want to, it's not about human beings. It's just about the fact there are these incredibly complicated forms of life now. And it's not just that they're complicated, but the complications are doing jobs for them, like they're functionally complex. But there are things being done that are good for those creatures, so to speak. Anyway, that's kind of the way I start. So is there more, Thomas, on your question that I can answer? Do you
my question was, how would another kind of natural selection look like? If it's not if it's not hyper creative, then how would it look like?
Oh, I see. Yeah, it looks exactly like the process that happens in all these models. And so let me tell you how it looks. What happens is there are various interesting things happening, like the stuff I showed you in those figures. But if you just let the system keep on going, eventually nothing new happens. Mm-hmm. Like there may be some change, but it's the same. You're just sort of revisiting the same old stuff. And you don't find the continual production of new kinds of functional complexity in these models. So there is natural selection, but it's always natural selection among the same kinds of things, essentially. So they never make these leaps to, for example, in the history of life, the leap from single-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms. That's a functional, that gives you all kinds of additional functional power. You can do things with multiple cells that you simply can't do with one cell. So that was one example. And so that's an example of what I mean by this sort of hyper creativity. These qualitatively new kinds of things are being produced by a process of natural selection. I think but there's some other details that we haven't put our finger on yet. And if I've got a bookshelf of books that talk about this by philosophers and biologists. So there's no shortage of, and Stephen Gould's book, Wonderful Life, is the first one on the shelf there. And he really understands this question very well. And the thing is, he thinks he has a simple answer, which I know is not the right answer, because I've been testing it with these computer models, and what he says is just not the case. Let's see. We should let Gerge, you've had your hand up for a while. I should give you a chance to.
Yeah. Thanks for your answers. Thanks.
I have several questions now. I think I have to connect one of my questions to what Tamás asked about, and now it became really complicated because you told us a lot meanwhile. So how would you connect the basic idea of values in the process of evolution and hypercreativity? So I was thinking about examples here. So what would be the value in becoming extremely creative? Now, there's one thing that came to mind. It's basically from kind of evolutionary psychology, where people studied the variety of personality types in humans, or the personality variation, let's say, in humans. So what you see is that in the best personality models, there are a bunch of them, but I will go with big five. You have 5 dimensions in which there's loads of variation among humans. Now, to the extent that other species were measured in this respect, I know about some studies on chimps. Those variables are not as rich as in the case of humans. So humans seem to be more variable in the sense that individuals can be more different from each other. So there's a richness among humans that's basically attributable as a quality to the species itself. Now, in this sense, this species is really creative, I think. And it seems that there's value in that because it allows us to solve more biological problems. So there are different levels to this value. So probably there are people who are coping better with certain kind of environmental challenges because of their personality types or because of their mental architecture. And then well, I think that's enough. So as a group, human beings, let's imagine a classic tribe. As a group, they are much more efficient in finding solutions because the group is really varied, and there will be someone who will be able to come up with a solution, for example.
Yeah.
Whereas in, I don't know, a wolf tribe, a wolf pack, you won't have that because wolves are not that different from each other.
Yeah. So let's see if I can. So there are a number, as you pointed out, okay, there are a number of questions in there that are interesting. Let me try to address a couple of the central ones. I'm sure I won't address everything, but let me get started by saying a few things. So first of all, when I'm talking about value in the context of biological teleology, I'm thinking of the benefit provided by these functional traits for individual organisms that have those traits, or also maybe for the lineage that species, so to speak, of organism. But I don't presume that there's any value for the whole system that any of this happens. I don't presume that it's somehow better for the biosphere to be more functionally complex like it is right now. It's just happened. It's good for the survivors and bad for the losers, but I'm talking about the survivors, and I'm saying they're surviving because they have traits that are especially good for them as individual organisms or as lineages.
But am I right? You said that you would consider lineages, so like David Hall's species as individuals idea.
That's right. That's right. So that's true. But the point is, I mainly want to just be clear that some people have a view of evolution according to which there's some goal, something it's heading towards. There's some value in the whole system heading in a certain direction, and I'm not talking about that kind of thing. I'm just talking about a much more prosaic kind of value where it's in biological case, not in all cases, but in the biological case, it's typically simply the value of continuing to survive as opposed to go out of existence, either a lineage or an organism. And so it's very kind of elemental and transactional, these kind of values. They're not on a grandiose scale. It's not that the world is somehow getting better by any of this happening. It's all just happening. Yeah. But the individual winners, they're benefiting, and the losers are suffering. Now, I think that you raised another really interesting point, which is that for some lineages, it could be beneficial to have a variety of different kinds of organisms in the lineage. and there's an idea that is been talked about for a while that there are just benefits of diversity because you basically have a store of solutions to different possible problems that might come up. And so it's easier, you're more flexible as a lineage, you can cope with more kinds of situations, you can deal with curveballs better that come in over the transom. So I think that's still the kind of thing that could play a role in my account. So that kind of complex value, the value of variety itself, that's something that could play a role for a lineage and could explain why some lineages survive and others don't, in which case they would definitely fit right into the kind of account I have been giving. So it does, at least I'm imagining it applies to those kinds of cases more or less out of the box. But still, it doesn't imply there's something good about the whole direction of evolution. There's something good about the final state, anything like that.
Okay, but would you say that this creativity in the sense of increasing the variability in the lineage is something that has intrinsic value for the lineage?
It might or it might not. So let me just say, let me be clear that and the only way to tell is, if the more varied lineages survive and the less varied ones don't, that's been good for them. But it could turn out that in some cases, like if you have an environment which is very static, you don't need a lot of variety. That's an overhead. That's like an extra tax. So you don't want it. And when I'm talking about hypercreativity, I should be very clear. I haven't clarified yet, but I'm not assuming there's anything good about hypercreativity.
No, that was one important thing I wanted to clarify.
Yeah, let me be clear about that. I'm just assuming that I have two separate ideas. One is that value is important in teleology. The second one is that hypercreativity has actually happened in biological evolution and in cultural evolution, and no one knows how to explain it because we can't produce a model that exhibits that kind of behavior, even simple models. So it just happens, it's kind of an accident that these two different things are part of, I'm talking about both of them today, because I don't think that the hypercreativity there's no essential connection with value there. The reason I brought it up is that the way of operationalizing value that I was talking about does give you a way to get evidence now about hypercreativity. And I thought that was interesting to say that this idea of value being a role in teleology has an important heuristic value that we look for in fruitful scientific ideas, because they lead to new questions, which can lead to new research projects and unfold, illuminate new phenomena. And I think that's happening with this, the hypercreativity. So it's just, it's more that the operationalization enables us in principle to get new kinds of evidence about hypercreativity, such as either from models or even better from real world data, like the patent data. And since then, I've looked at other kinds of social data, because there's more and more, as you know, more and more electronic, digital traces of our social lives that are just being left around, and they're accumulating. And so what we do is go out and find them and scrape them, and then build models of them and see what we can learn. It's like the people in biologists, they have these huge databases of all the genomes that they've sequenced and everything, and it's a huge resource for that field. And so we're trying to sort of we're starting to create a similar resource, which is this rich data source that we can analyze.
I don't know enough about these agent-based simulations. I suppose these are basically agent-based simulations that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But let me add some clarificatory questions. So, you told us that basically that there are loads of intelligent people that are after a good theory of hypercreativity, but you can't really find any good explanation as yet, because nothing similar can be seen in those simulations. Now, as I don't know enough about them, let me ask a dumb question. So as far as I see, the environment, and I only saw like some rudimentary simulations myself, but the environment is usually quite simple in most of these simulations, as far as I understood things. And then that it just seems to be a kind of basic issue. So what do you know about this? How important is the interaction with a complex and changing environment in creativity?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some people think that whatever creativity there is merely reflecting the complexity in the external environment.
Yeah.
In fact, Peter Godfrey Smith, his first book was essentially arguing for that. This is not a well-known book. I forget the title of it, but it's essentially about this. And so good hypothesis. I mean, good suggestion that a lot of people in artificial life have, the agent-based people who are trying to investigate this have had that idea. And so the main thing that people have found is when they try to make environments more complicated in any way that we can think of, what happens is the behavior changes somewhat, but not in a fundamental qualitative way. Because what happens is you build in various ways to change the environment, and when the environment changes in those ways, the population responds, but there's like a fixed set of ways that the environment is changing, and so you get a fixed set of responses, and doesn't show this continual generation of new kinds of things, qualitatively new kinds of things. What always happens in these models is you let them run and there's interesting stuff that happens for a while, and then it just kind of reaches a steady state that might involve change, but it's just revisiting the same old strategies and mixing and matching the same old stuff. That's not what's happened that happens for life for a while, and all of a sudden multi-celled organisms happen, and then you get this explosion of new things. And then you get things like humans come along, then you get an explosion of things like technology or social phenomena. And so it just hasn't turned out empirically that when we make environments more complicated, that by itself is driving this continual ratchet. Now, there isn't a variant of what you're saying that I think is probably part of the answer. And a lot of people have this idea. I don't think it's the whole answer, though, which is that you need to recognize that, well, when you acknowledge that the environment, the main part of the environment for most actual forms of life that they interact with, and that's crucial for their interaction, are other forms of life.
Yeah.
There's also like the amount of energy in the, stuff like that, availability of food, but actually the food is typically other forms of life, plant forms of life or animal forms of life. But anyway, so when you realize that a lot of the environment in fact is a lot of the environments for a given organism or a given species is in fact other organisms or other species. So first of all, I think that's true. And it's not that, I'm not the one who pointed that out. That's been known for a long time. They're recognized, I think, widely shared. And now when you realize that you have these species that are evolving, as one species adapting to its environment of other species, those other species' environment may be changing because this one guy the one species is evolving. And so now their environment has changed because of this process of evolution. And so now that's poking them in a new direction. And so now they may respond. And then the first guy's environment is now changed because his environment has evolved. And so now he's getting pushed in a new natural selection. And so this is something that could, in principle, just keep on going in new directions. But when you code it up in a model, every time someone has tried to do that, you end up getting a bunch of interesting stuff, and then it kind of reaches this plateau. And you just let it run all night, plateau. Let it run all year, plateau.
Mm-hmm. That's just quite interesting. So, okay, I don't have enough active background knowledge activate at the moment concerning the possible factors, but it got me really excited. Let's get back to this point. So you already said in the beginning that somehow you think that living beings have intrinsic values or interests. And I just wanted to ask you, what's your theory that grounds this attribution? So what do you think grounds in a structural, biological, I don't know, sense, this attribution that they have their own interests? There are some answers to this in the philosophy of biology literature. I just would be interested in your view on this.
I don't have anything very detailed to say here. It's to me, it's almost like a intuition that I have. I mean, it makes sense to me. I think it makes sense to a lot of people that forms of life have their own interests. I'm not quite sure what that is based on or grounded in, and I'm not even sure that it's true, but I do think it's the way that's my preconception. First of all, it could be just wrong. But if it's not wrong, it still needs to be articulated so I could, until it's articulated, I can't answer your question other than just saying it seems true to me. Doesn't it seem true to you? And I expect that it will seem true to you that forms of life in some straightforward sense that a philosopher should be able to articulate, and probably has, but I just haven't looked at it recently enough or don't know about it. I have pursued this a little bit. I was interested in environmental ethics. I got into environmental ethics, for example, because I think they are interested in that's one place where philosophers are trying to develop the idea that non-human forms of life can have interests and things can matter for them. Most people are willing to say, okay, that is true for sentient creatures because they're sentient. So that's what the animal liberation movement, Peter Singer would agree something like that. But if they're not sentient, he says, who cares?
Yeah.
So a bacterium is not sentient. Nothing wrong with killing it. And I'm just saying, I think it has an interest in its own. Like it's trying to do something. It's trying to stay alive. And I don't have a way of. I would love it. I think this is another question which could have an answer, but I haven't worked it out. I would check the place I was finding the most help, and the last thing when I was working on this last was what's his name? I think it's Ron Sandler. Is that his name? He's a philosopher of science, but he also works on this ethics stuff at Northeastern. I think his name is Sandler. I can go double check. And I've written a paper or two about this, referring to this, but sort of just getting started. But so I don't have a detailed answer. There
are two things that came to mind, and it might be interesting for you. I'm not sure, but one approach I favor is based on the idea of biological autonomy, where biological systems are defined as self-perpetuating, self-maintaining entities, which basically means that all their internal processes are organized in cycles, and those cycles are such that every step in the cycle somehow contributes to the boundary conditions that are required for the whole cycle to go through. Yeah. Because then you can analyze any kind of change as a step towards the self-maintenance or something that deviates from that.
Yeah. I get that idea. I do think autonomy and agency are important concepts that are relevant in biology for biological organisms. And I think autonomy, analyzing that is important. task. And I know there's some people who have been working on that too. The most recent that I'm aware of, do you know about this? It's this group in San Sebastian, the philosophers of science there. Alvaro Moreno is one.
Yeah.
I think he recently wrote a book on biological autonomy, as I recall.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's there. I think that's very interesting work and important stuff. However, there is a ground floor issue that I would want to get over, which is that self-maintenance and that kind of process can exist in context. Well, there are systems that are self-maintaining that are clearly not alive and don't seem to have any kind of teleology involved. Let me put it this way. Let me switch the perspective. There is an approach to teleology, you guys probably know, no doubt, Ernest Nagel and things like that, people like that, who adopt this sort of what I think of as a systems, sort of self-maintaining systems approach to the key. They think that's the key. Like I think explaining by value is the key to teleology. They think self-maintenance is the key. Goal-directed systems.
Yeah.
And the main problem I have there is that a lot of those systems aren't alive, like a whirlpool or a tornado. You know, they're self-maintaining systems for a while, and they're driven, you know, dissipative systems. But I don't think they have interests. I don't think a tornado or a whirlpool has interests.
But I think there's an interesting distinction that can be made between living things and tornadoes, and that a tornado is to some extent self-maintaining, but not in the same sense. So it doesn't do anything to maintain its own boundary condition. It's not a process in which the steps are somehow are contributing to those external factors that create the tornado in the first place. Whereas
you don't think so?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not. So I'm not so sure what the right answer is there. I can see why it might not seem that way, but I know that these systems are. I'm going to reserve judgment about whether you're right. I know that it seems like you're right, but I'm not sure that you are right.
Me either. But
let me just say, I think that you're going in exactly the right direction, which would be say it's self-maintenance of a special kind that could ground interest, perhaps. Yeah, not just self-maintenance.
Personally really interested in at the moment. I was just curious about your view, but okay, thank you.
Yeah, but the main thing I have is I think it's an important idea. I think autonomy and the kind of self-organization that's involved in that autonomy, maintaining your identity of a complex system with material and energy flowing through the system, but the system still remains. You can identify the system over time as it's going through all these changes. Understanding that, especially the ones that have the richness that living systems do, I think that's a very important question. And I think there's a lot of new interest in that and new work on that. And I think that's a great thing to be studying right now, like as opposed to 50 years ago, when there's just a lot more that we know now and more people who are interested in it. And so there are more ideas. Certainly in the, and I think you're already on to, you're already aware of a lot of that. So it's partly a question of just getting the getting the details right. And I basically applaud it. I'm happy to get my hands dirty and work through the details too, because I think it'll pay off.
Well, thank you very much.
Can I come back for a short?
Yeah, sure.
About a short point about the self-maintenance, because especially to me, when people explain self-maintenance being the key to the goal-directed systems, sometimes it feels like it is almost like begging the question, and they're kind of defining almost like, because they don't want to say that organisms or that living beings are special because they are live, because it wouldn't explain anything. So they refer that, oh, okay, because they are self-maintaining themselves. But one of the questions I get, especially in the philosophy talks, when I mention this point, they say, but then as a human being, I don't choose to self-maintain myself. And is it a problem, right? Like evolution made me I happen to be like this, and I exchange some energy and matter with the environment, but I don't choose to do this. My biological self has this agency, but I can also stop doing this by killing myself, for example, or I have other kind of more moral agency when it comes to the moral decisions, but maybe those decisions are not that autonomous or that free that I want to imagine that they are free, right? Maybe my environment or my friends and my family affected me in a certain way that I was never making any autonomous decisions at all. In the same way, I didn't choose to be alive. But is it a problem, really? So I'm not sure whether this is a problem in terms of the organisms, but also I'm not sure this is the key to the goal-directed system, that this is what we are, what we create in terms of goals are coming from the self-maintaining systems, because wouldn't be the same if the system, it doesn't self-maintain but being created by other entity. Maybe it's the question, especially for artificial intelligence, because the problem is that they look like they don't self-maintain, but the system will know whether it self-maintains or not.
Good. Well, thank you, Dilara. That's good to give me a chance to just elaborate on this a little bit. First thing is, I think that there are two separate things going on that it will help to distinguish. So one is the kind of biological kind of teleology that human beings have, but the biological teleology that we have is not the sort of thing that, we are conscious, intentional agents, but it's not the sort of thing that we are consciously, intentionally choosing. So the fact that we don't choose to self-maintain is going to happen anyway. All you do is eat and it just happens. Doesn't mean that it's not teleological. It just means it's not the mental kind of teleology, it's the biological kind of teleology. So that's the first thing. I wouldn't worry about the fact that it's not intentional. Two other points, though, that I think your comment makes me think of that are important. One is that when we talk about self-maintenance, well, first of all, as we were saying earlier in the conversation with Gergi, that you have to be clear about exactly which kind of self-maintenance. And so there are details there that are important that I'm ignoring at the moment. But a second thing I wanted to say was that another thing we have to recognize is that systems that are maintaining, if we're talking about forms of life, they're maintaining certain things and they're changing in other things. Like, think about a form of life which starts as a caterpillar and becomes a butterfly. That's a huge change. And there was some kind of self-maintenance throughout this whole transition, but the end result's very different from the beginning result. So something was not maintained. So self-maintenance is, you have to recognize that these systems that are alive and reflecting this hypercreativity can evolve and develop during their own lifetimes. And so self-maintenance has got to, this is why the details about the self-maintenance matter. You have to, but let's assume that those details could be worked out. They need to be worked out. The last thing I want to say is another way to put my worry about whether self-maintenance is the central thing in teleology, I'm dubious that it is that, but I think that you can get out of a lot of these problems by filling in enough extra conditions. But the reason you need the extra conditions is that most kind of garden variety forms of self-maintenance without a lot of extra conditions give rise to systems that I would, like for example, a counterexample to the typical Nagel analysis of functions and things is a bowl with a marble in it. And it will seek, the marble will always end up down at the bottom of the bowl when you disturb it. And in fact, he uses that example. And I would say that's not an example of teleology or function. That's an example of something functioning as something. It's like taking a rock and using it as a doorstop. So is it a doorstop? Well, it's functioning as a doorstop, but that's not like its function. That's not its biological function or its natural function. We're just using it in that way. You could take a form of life, like a dog, and use it as a doorstop, but that's not the dog's function either. So the trick for a self-maintenance centered view is to show that it's not merely like acting as if it's teleological. It is genuinely teleological, which means it genuinely, that's what its proper function is, so to speak. That's terminology people sometimes use in biological cases. Like the function of our heart, the proper function, the biological function is to pump blood, not to make a sound that could be used by doctors to diagnose your health. It does that too. And that even benefits us, but that's not why it's there. That's not part, it wasn't naturally selected for that, apparently. So anyway, that's the other thing I would say about self-maintenance. The worry is to make it not merely this kind of functioning as teleology, but more like the proper function teleology. And I think it's possible, but that's the target.
Yeah, I want to say a few things about that quickly. I know we are kind of using more time, but yeah, I think in that sense, this self-maintenance being the key to the organisms or goal-directed systems, instead of explaining it like that, because we talked about this like tornadoes or other kind of system in the nature which are not alive, but looks like they are doing something similar to self-maintaining themselves. But I think the problem, maybe I'm getting it, is in terms of teleology, in terms of function, that how we are talking about the function is like the heart has a function, or our biological parts, or as an organism as a whole, we have a function. Then would it be wrong to just define that function, or define that something is teleological if it is evolutionary? Then maybe we can just kind of exclude all the other natural systems in the nature, because they look like they don't evolve in the same sense that organisms do evolve, or populations do evolve. But they just exist in a certain way, so that they just seem there, and they can be just changed because of other physical interactions in the nature, but they don't think like they're evolving in the sense of Darwin's definition of evolution. So I'm a bit scared of saying that. Maybe then we can say that teleology is only applied to things that can evolve, or maybe it's just teleology can be applied to just evolution. Something needs to be part of evolution to be teleological.
Yeah, good. Another good question. So first thing I would say is, when we're talking about biological teleology, the thing I explained is only going to be relevant when you're talking about features that were the result of natural selection. So they do have to evolve. Even if you have an organism now, or a species now, which is not particularly evolving anymore, maybe, or at least doesn't seem to be, that doesn't mean that the features don't fit this evolutionary story, because they're there presumably because they evolved somewhere in the past. Like where did those features come from? If it's a form of life, we know it came from some other form of life, and we know that it all started with these like bacteria-like things. And so, you need something like this kind of a hypercreative process to get to where we are now from there, and it presumably involved evolution. But it also presumably involves something more than merely natural selection, because I've told you we can build these systems, like all these models, which definitely involve natural selection, but they don't show this kind of hypercreativity. But remember, this is just biological teleology, and these other kinds of teleology, like mental teleology, those don't involve evolution. That's not the mechanism. There's another kind. It's like the human mind, which becomes the mechanism for having values affect the real world. It's because you have desires and things like that. In the biological case, it's a different sort of mechanism. It's this evolutionary mechanism. I want to go back to what we were saying in response to Thomas's question, because that's only one kind of biological teleology. There could be others that involve, even things like moral values, maybe. And that's another variant of biological teleology for certain kinds of organisms that are complicated enough to have morality. like humans, and
Exactly,
maybe only
yeah.
humans at the moment. But that's, so in other words, I'm not saying there's no other kind of biological teleology. I'm just saying the one I've been focusing on is this one which is connected with evolution. But I have a unified theory of teleology, but it's kind of like Aristotle's unified theory of existence, which is there are different forms that existence takes in different kinds of entities. So I'm saying there are different forms that teleology takes in different kinds of entity. There's a unity to them all, but there's also a plurality of kinds. And I was focusing on three main types, but I don't think it just has to stop with those three.
Okay, I just saw that maybe to me, I think mental teleology was almost part of biological teleology, because kind of morality to me evolved because of biological evolution in a way. So I see them as very connected in that sense. But yeah, thanks very much. Yeah.
Yeah, Gergely.
Just came to mind that there are some theories of morality that are based on, the theory of evolution. So there are theories of reciprocity and stuff like that that are basically biological, and it seems that they have pretty nice explanations for some of our moral intuitions. I doubt that we can ground Kantianism in terms of some evolutionary explanation, but we can ground at least a huge bunch of our moral intuitions in ways like that. And it came to mind that we are talking about, mental teleology and stuff like that, that Donald Campbell had this idea of a vicarious selection. And it seems to me that there's a kind of nested hierarchy of vicarious selectors in this case as well. So it might be that Tamás's issue concerning morality could be somehow worked out in terms of those vicarious selectors. So
yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. That reminds me of a recent book. Who was the author? It was in this vein. I forget the name of the author, but she was arguing that moral institutions and practices do have a survival value for social groups. So it's kind of a cultural evolution story rather than more than a biological evolution story. And this is an attempt to respond to the street argument that has to do with what's it called, a criticism of evolution-based views of morality.
The evolutionary debunking argument, you mean, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And so this was one of the attempts to respond to that. And the response says, first of all, use cultural evolution, which I think is an interesting thing, rather than biological evolution. And what this would show is that, morality can have a biological function. So this is a different way of answering your question, Thomas, maybe. It would be that, societies that have, the picture is societies that have moral codes of the right kind will hang together better, they'll survive better, and they are the ones that, and it just fits the survival of the successful story. So it's a kind of natural selection, but it's in a more social context or cultural context. And so I think there is a straightforward path. I think you're right, there's a straightforward path to connect moral values, to give them a kind of, well, this case it would be I don't know what you'd say, it's a biological teleology or a cultural teleology, but it's an evolution-based teleology. Yeah. And that's a different kind of way of connecting these than what we had talked about earlier. It's the value. Notice that here, morality is a system of values, but it's not those values that are doing the explaining. It's rather the fact that they have survival value for groups that use them. That's what's doing the explaining. So it's the low grade value that's doing the explaining, and you can explain high grade value with it. You can explain why moral values are around because they have a low-grade value benefit.
I'm just got really excited about this. Let me try to impute something into the discussion. So the stuff about morality always becomes exciting in the exact scenario Tamás already mentioned, when I sacrifice myself, when I show a level of moral autonomy that seems to go against nature or my nature or something like that. This is the kind of situation where we really, raise our brows. Okay, well, why would you do that from an evolutionary or biological point of view? But then I think it was years ago when I last read John Stuart Mill on utilitarianism, and there he talks about higher values, which is a really contradictory part of the theory. But it always struck me as a kind of really important problem, because those higher values are about postponing all our more immediate urges, more immediate reactions to things, and it seems that there's a huge value in being able to go against your own nature, in the sense that I can imagine a lot of contexts where it contributes to my survival in the long term, not in the short term, but in the long term. Mm-hmm. So somehow maybe this whole high-level morality-based autonomy that can even go against my seemingly my most basic biological interest can have really good longer term effects, and that's the whole story. But I know that wouldn't satisfy an ethicist necessarily. So I'm curious about your opinions there. But that's something that seems to do the work for me at the moment.
Yeah. I guess I don't have any strong reaction immediately, other than to say I think it's definitely I would encourage you to explore it. I think it's along with some other things we've brought up. I think there's some things that are dead ends, but I think there are other things that are open to explore and might pay off. And I would put this one in, your last suggestion in this category. As I mentioned, when I was starting to get down to working through these kinds of really the gory details about the value, that's when I got distracted by this other thing, because I did this side project with the patents and discovered that there's a whole lot of stuff there's a lot of low-hanging fruit over there. And like I say, I've been spending my time over there. So it's a treat to think about these issues again with you all. But I don't have answers worked out. I have hunches and I have opinions about fruitful areas and unfruitful areas. And I think we've identified a bunch of fruitful areas. And I also just want to, give a lot of encouragement to those of you who are thinking about these things and pushing it forward. And, if I had, if there were, 48 hours in the day, I might try to work on that too. But, I have just other things that are taking my time at the moment. So I don't think I wouldn't look for me to solve these problems. I'll be looking towards you guys to solve these problems.
Thank you for the encouragement. And it was just like, I got really excited about the thought, but
yeah,
we'll see what happens.
Yeah. I think there's, one thing that strikes me from, I think one take-home lesson that has been valuable for me from my efforts in this area, and it's that a lot of things that people think are non-starters, they're wrong about. Like the hypercreativity. I think most biologists, most philosophers of biologists don't realize that that's an open question. They assume that, as I said, they assume high school biology, oh yeah, Darwin explained this, didn't he? Well, if you read the Origin of the Species, the last paragraph, in fact, the last sentence, the last two sentences, he clearly did think he knew what the answer was, but he was wrong. And I think that I remember vividly when I was talking with a biologist who happened to be based in Oklahoma, about this when I was first having this idea, and she vehemently rejected that there was an open question. And I think the reason was simply that she was in Oklahoma and there are lots of creationists there, and she did not want to give anyone the idea that biology didn't have the answers. Didn't want to let anyone think that, because creationists would love it. And I think that was just not the right response. She should admit that we didn't know that answer and then go find a good answer to give the creationists.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And that's a really interesting situation that you just described. So am I right that basically we are still talking about the same issue of the growth of complexity that was identified by Schrödinger in his What is Life? A short book, like.
Yeah, that's a great book. I don't remember him focusing on the growth of complexity. I thought it was more the question of the title of the book, which was what's different between living systems and non-living systems. And I thought the brilliant idea in that book, well, first of all, great book, I think. And I thought the brilliant idea was to say metabolism is at the center of life. That's what makes life. So it's kind of a self-maintenance view, because metabolism is a kind of self-maintaining process of a certain interesting, complex form. And so that's, I think, where, I mean, he also had some comments, some, prescient speculations about, what did he call it? Amorphous. He basically was describing DNA before DNA was discovered. I forget what he called it. It was like a irregular crystal or something. Yeah. Anyway, he had some term for it, and he thought there must be something like that. So that was another thing that people say. Oh, they point out that he had discovered that early on or hypothesized that. But I think actually the big idea was metabolism was at the center. Self-maintenance was at the center, and I do think it's at the center, but it's not the only thing, I think, at the center.
As far as
you have to be very careful about how you define it.
Yeah, but as far as I remember, it was a long time ago when I had that book in my hand. But as far as I remember, he has a list of unanswered questions in biology. And then among them, there was the growth of complexity.
Ah, okay, I didn't know that.
That was the reason why I brought this up. But again, now that you referred back to Darwin and the last two sentences of his book, then so would you say then that this is the understanding that just came to mind, that what he basically provided us with is preconditions basically for hypercreativity to occur, but not the exact conditions for that to happen.
Yeah. So I would say it's necessary, but not sufficient.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, that's right. But he didn't know that it wasn't sufficient.
Yeah.
Because he was just sitting in his library thinking about it. And how are you going to tell it's not sufficient? How's Stephen Jay Gould going to tell? How's he going to discover that his hunch in his book was wrong? It would be his hunch was that if you replay the tape of life, remember, there's no reason to think things are going to get more complex at all. It was a total accident that things got more complex.
Yeah, but then it's really relevant to teleology, isn't it? Because there are different questions concerning theology and biology, and one would be teleology of life as a process, as a kind of whole. We haven't talked about it really in this discussion yet, but the growth of complexity is something that, well, it seems that the whole process goes towards a kind of higher complexity. That's a kind of direction. There's a propensity towards that.
Yeah.
And then, that could be interpreted in a kind of teleological sense as well.
That's where I want to be careful here. This is why I brought up this point about I wasn't trying to say that value was the goal or anything like that. And I do think so I did some work on this. I think this is a very interesting question, the arrow of complexity. So I think there is an arrow of complexity in biological evolution. That's another way to put this hypercreativity point that I was making. That's just saying different words. I mean, I'm focusing on functional complexity, not just complexity because it's like a bunch of arbitrary things doing nothing. I'm talking about complexity that's helping you live a better life. And I think it's clear that that's what's going on in biological complexity for the most part. Even Gould would admit something like that or agree with something like that. And I think Darwin's right that natural selection is at least one of the conditions that's necessary. And you're going to have systems that produce this, and natural selection is one of the key ingredients. I don't think it's required in every hypercreative system, probably. But anyway, certainly the ones we're familiar with, it's present in biology. But as I said, I don't think it's enough. And I think you can prove it very simply because you can design systems that clearly have natural selection happening in them, and they just do not exhibit that kind of growth of complexity. It's just an empirical fact. And there's no way you could tell without trying it. And that's why I think the problem with Gould and with Darwin is the only way you can really learn that those hypotheses are wrong is by building computer models and seeing what happens. And I told you what has happened. Every time someone is, people are, they have lots of good ideas and hypotheses, but when you code it up, it doesn't seem like it's the secret sauce yet. So there's, what I predict? I predict that it's not, I don't think it's a huge new insight we need, but we need some new insight. There's some piece of the story we don't have yet. And when we add it, then we'll be able to generate models that produce the right kind of behavior. It just requires, the only way to find this out, I think, is through trial and error with these models. And so, Gould just didn't do that kind of thing. So that's why he wouldn't have found this out. Some other biologists do this kind of modeling, and I think they're more sympathetic to it. And of course, Darwin didn't even imagine doing that kind of modeling. But one of my points, part of the reason I've been spending so much time since I started doing this modeling to do more of it, is that it does seem like that's a way to get traction. There are definitely things that you can learn that I didn't. I wasn't aware of. As a philosopher, we're not trained in doing modeling. And I just happened to back into it. And there's a particular story about my background of how it happened. Most of my students can't program. And so I can tell them about what, as a philosopher, how you could benefit if you were to learn that, and some of them do that, but that's rare, because that's not part of the traditional philosophical curriculum. Notice that formal logic, of course, is part of the traditional philosophical curriculum. I'm sure all your students learn formal logic. All my students learn formal logic. And I think it's just, and notice, of course, 200 years ago, philosophers didn't learn formal logic. The field hardly, this is before Frege and Russell and all that. It was Russell, basically, who made it imperative for philosophers to learn formal logic, because he showed a bunch of interesting stuff that you could do as a philosopher when you knew it. And so now it's required for all of us. Even if you're an ethics student, you still have to learn formal logic. You may never use it. I think, but no philosophy program that I know requires computational, facility. But I hope that, by the 22nd century, that will be a requirement, because I think it's just as powerful, if not more powerful, than formal logic is for what we're trying to do as philosophers. Because basically these computer simulations enable you to ask thought experiments that are more complicated, and you can be sure what the answers are. Because when you do a thought experiment just from sitting in your chair, first of all, there's a certain limit to how complicated you can make them before you can't think through the consequences. You can't even imagine you know what's going on. And secondly, even if you do think you know what's going on, like Stephen Jay Gould, if you replay the tape of life, you're not sure you're right. But if you make a model, you can tell how it behaves, and you're often surprised. So I think it's a tool that philosophers can use in all kinds of contexts, and I'm telling that to my students. But I'm an army of one. So we'll see. And I'm not a Bertrand Russell, so I don't think that, if Bertrand Russell speaks, the masses listen. When I speak, a few of my friends listen.